Today on Solutions for Mental Wellness, Terence Dawkins and I are going to have a conversation about the mind, brain, body connection and how trauma affects that. Terence, today I want us to talk a little bit about how trauma exists on a continuum. You can have trauma that is very mild but happens over time, like these intergenerational or the transgenerational traumas. Those are more complex. They happen over time versus the car accidents or the natural disasters. Those are traumatic events that occur, and how one manages those events is very much based on what they learned about themselves and their community when they were growing up. So let's start today by just talking about this continuation or continuum of trauma that exists.
Yeah. So I read this book, and I'm pretty sure you have it, or of course you know about it, but The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, yes. Bessel van der Kolk.
Yes. I can never pronounce his name, but that's the one.
Yes.
But The Body Keeps the Score is definitely a great book because it really describes in detail about post-traumatic PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, and it talks about the history behind it. It talks about the neuroscience behind what happens in the brain as it regards to trauma, and then it also takes you into how to start healing from it with different therapy modalities. So it's a great, great book.
It is.
And when I started to read that book and then I started connecting it to the work of intergenerational trauma, it started to make a lot of sense. And how the brain has its sole function is to have us survive.
Yes.
And what happens during traumatic or extremely stressful events is it goes into shutdown mode in order for us to survive. And it talks about the different areas of the brain, such as the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and how all these different areas work together.
So the amygdala, how I remember that is Amy G. Dalla. That's how to spell it. She's an emotional gal. So
Yep.
the amygdala is the emotional part of the brain, the very core. And for the severe or significant traumatic experiences, that those are stored there in a very rudimentary or very crude way.
Yep.
Okay. And so the hippocampus, that part of our brain directly interacts with our memory,
Yes.
our ability to remember and recall. And so it's not the elephant never forgets, it's the hippocampus.
Yes.
The hippo never forgets.
Exactly.
And so then the other brain structure was?
The prefrontal cortex, or the cortex.
And that's what organizes
It organizes, creates reasoning and meaning.
Okay.
And so your alarm system goes off, meaning the amygdala is like, oh, I remember something like this happening before, danger, danger, danger. And then it goes to the memory. So now it goes to, like you said, the hippocampus of what have I associated with this before. But then what happens during a traumatic event is the cortex, which is responsible for reasoning and language, shuts down.
It's bypassed.
Yeah, because it's so overwhelming, I can't make sense of it. So let's put this energy into other areas that needs our attention, because now we're in a state of danger. So that means now that language part shuts down, all the other energy is exerted to different areas to prepare yourself for that fight, flight, or freeze response. You know, the adrenaline's pumping, and you know you're ready to respond, to react to whatever dangerous situation is happening. But the problem is cortisol.
Yes.
Cortisol.
I'm friends with cortisol.
It's supposed to help bring you down from that stress response.
Yeah.
So over time, if you have lower levels of cortisol, it's going to be very hard for you to come down off of a stress response. Remember I told you on a different episode that when we experience stressful events and it gets to a biological level of how we interpret these events and how we respond to these events. So somebody who has an anxious attachment style could have a very high stress response or sensitive stress response due to different traumas happening to them over time. And now they have low levels of cortisol, which means I stay in this stress response mode a lot longer than someone else would. And that's how maybe you would experience a stressful response and it'd be traumatic and I not, because I can come down from that activation quicker than you can, and you live in it.
Yeah, so the person might be feeling like they're always under attack or they're rocking on ready. Sometimes I will say to my husband and kids, I feel like I'm rocking on ready, that at any minute something's going to happen and I'm just going to have an emotional response.
Exactly. Because I can't make I never understood how people could go through things and then you ask them about it and they say, I don't know. It didn't make sense to me until I read this book, until I continued to do research. It's because they couldn't put language or explanation to what was happening because their body and brain was doing something different to survive. And then it started to make sense. And so that's how these trauma responses can start to be developed and created. And the use of therapy helps you not only help regulate your trauma response, but sometimes also help you realize the associations you've made with different events or situations or sensory things. So what you hear, what you taste, what you see, what you feel, what you smell. So all these sensory inputs go into the brain. It makes so associations with it, and then if it makes an association with something that's happened before that was traumatic, now your body has this stress response. Now I'm reacting emotionally and I have no idea why. It's because the body keeps the score. Cortisol is the hormone that helps you bring you down from a stress response.
And because it's a hormone, it's secreted naturally in our bloodstream.
And if we don't have enough of it, if we get activated into it because of a situation to that stress response, we live in that stress response a lot longer than someone who with normal levels of cortisol, which means if I stay in this activation state longer, then that can start having an impact on how I respond to situations. It can start having an impact on me medically, such as high blood pressure and other different medical issues. Obesity, right? The gastrointestinal issues. So that's why when people in this activation state, they'll be like, oh, I just feel something queasy going on in my stomach, or, I can't really think straight. I can't really focus. And that's because you're in this activation mode. And now if it takes you longer to come out, over time, that starts to put wear and tear on your system. And now you got medical issues. That's why they say, stress is not good, because it can have all these other issues with medical diagnosis.
Yes. So before the pandemic, I love to do research. And so I was researching the relationship between gastrointestinal disease or challenges and trauma. What the data shows is that 67% of all individuals who went to gastroenterologists, who are medical professionals who focus on treating the gut health, 67% had psychogenic causes, meaning that there wasn't a physical origin that could be identified as the root cause. Since the pandemic, that number is greater than 80%. And so our mental stress, our stress that we endure in life has a direct impact on our physical body.
Yes.
Can you speak to more data like that you might have read?
Well, I don't have like specific numbers or anything like that, but I've definitely read and listened to videos that confirms just that. Because let's think about it. Over COVID, a lot of things happened over COVID. There was the shutdown to where we couldn't really go to work, or
isolated. We become isolated.
And then I told you earlier in a different episode, we need connection with other people.
Yes.
In order to help regulate our own nervous systems, and so they don't get activated. We had this connection taken away from us, and the only way we could connect was through Zoom and video calls. And a lot of people they don't do well with connecting that way. So we kind of leave out the impact of how important human relationships are to us in
Yes.
regulating our bodies, regulating our nervous system until it was taken away.
Terrence, one of the things that I see in my practice is that children may come in for therapy, and I have what's called an enriched play therapy room. So there's many toys, there's many play items there. There are modalities for children to work out what they may have internalized. And in another episode, you talked about how children will internalize what they hear. They also internalize their experiences. And so in working with children, we can observe the fact that they have experienced abuse and neglect. Last year, I attended a conference. It was an online conference with Bessel van der Kolk, Dan Siegel, and Peter Levine. And in this training, Dan Siegel said, if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. And that's how we need to understand. Someone may not be able to pull a concrete memory from their mind for the very fact that you mentioned the brain shuts off. It freezes. So the child who is experiencing this trauma, in order to survive, the brain just shuts down. But there's other things taking place in the body, like cortisol is being released. And so these things are happening. So there is a physiological response. So we can, if we've had the proper training, we can say without a shadow of a doubt, this child has been sexually abused. This child has been physically abused. This child has been neglected. And the effects of that are displayed in play. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so like I said, our brains are always making associations. So how you said, you can kind of associate, if they're experiencing these physiological effects, or if they have different behaviors, different beliefs, how you observe them playing, you can make a determination or inference that, yeah, they've had some type of abuse or neglect going on. It's because when these children's bodies are responding a certain way, it looks very distinct. So again, if I'm playing with two dolls, and then how I play with those dolls will show you what's going on. If I see a doll with her skirt up, my brain may associate skirt up with a past sexual abuse experience. My physiological responses are going to be a lot differently, and then my actual response to what you see is a lot differently. But that's because my brain has made the association with skirt up and what's happened with the sexual abuse. And so a lot can be told from how children respond in certain situations. And again, looking at these situations and their responses and thinking about what happened to them in order for them to respond this way. That is like very key. What happened to you? That's actually another book, by the way.
Okay, let's talk about the effects that childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect can have on adolescents from a mind-brain-body connection.
Okay. If I can remember, we had a conversation earlier. You mentioned, was it research or something that was very interesting and I never heard before? Could you repeat what was for me?
About the psoas muscle?
Yes.
Okay. So there is research that shows when someone has been sexually abused, a child has been sexually abused, there is a muscle group in the body. It's called psoas major, and it connects the top half of the body to the bottom half of the body. Without this muscle group, we would not be connected as a whole body. So when a child is experiencing sexual abuse, the brain is hijacked. It shuts off. There's a bypass system that takes place for the child to survive. Because of my personal faith in a Heavenly Father and through the work of Jesus, I see it as a very compassionate way that we are designed, that God turns that off because He never meant for children to experience that. So the brain is bypassed, but the body is still in the experience. And so when a child is being sexually abused, that muscle that connects the top half of the body to the bottom half of the body becomes very tight. And it's like someone is taking a screwdriver into that part of the muscle group and just turning it. So children who have been, and adolescents, and then of course as we mature, adults can grow up and have physical pain because of an experience that they had that they may not have any concrete memory for. And so because of what the psoas muscle does to keep us connected within our own body, then our brain sometimes, going back to the signals, we can feel off about things. I had one trauma survivor. She was being attacked and she turned and started attacking herself because of just the mind-brain connection. She was thinking, I deserve to be hurt this way. This is what I need. And so I'm being attacked. So I'm going to turn on myself and join with my attacker. Now, when someone's not in their trauma, then that can cause them to feel crazy. And often my clients will come in and say, I have no idea why I was doing this, or I have no idea how this happened. And it's because the brain and the body, which is one, has disconnected from each other so that the person can survive. And what that did for her in that moment, her attacker stopped. And so we had to go back and explore what function did her turning against herself serve? Well, it made her abuser stop.
Yeah.
And so she no longer self-harms, and she only self-harmed very few times, but it was for a purpose. We do things for a purpose. And so our physical bodies and the connection that's made between our mind and our brain have an interaction and a relationship with each other. And so when we understand that an event or an experience that one may have had, we may not know the full story, they may not know the full story, but going back to what that training taught last year was, if everything leads to one conclusion, then therefore that is the conclusion. And when I have taken that approach with some of my clients who say, I can't remember chunks of my childhood. I can't remember chunks of time, but this is my experience. If I walk into a room and the door closes, I feel like I'm going to vomit. That's an extreme. That's incongruent with the context.
Yeah.
Go
and
ahead.
then because when you just said the door shuts, so let's go back to what we talked about in the previous episode. I feel trapped. So if someone says, "Yeah, I was going to this social event, and the doors open. We had a lot of people in there, and as soon as I walked in, they shut the door, and then I felt trapped." Boom. That's the trauma language that then kind of signals me to know, oh my
Yes.
God, this is they felt trapped. Then after they felt trapped, they had some type of maybe a physiological response to it.
Yes.
Their brain made an association with that physiological
Yes.
response, and now they're feeling anxious and overwhelmed, and they start to have behaviors surrounded around it. So that all connects to the trauma language. The trauma language, again, I'm trapped. I feel like something bad is going to happen. That also can be the place where someone can start to explore. Now let's figure out what's this connected with.
Terence, when you think about the mind-brain-body connection and transgenerational trauma, what comes to mind for you?
The absolute first thing that came to mind was, like you said earlier, the repeated experiences of trauma to a child from their parent or caregiver or someone else they're close to over time can create this sensitive nervous system. So pretty much I can become overly or extremely anxious because of something small that's incongruent with the situation. That's because over time I was trained that I need to have this response in order to survive or make sure that I'm okay. And when I have this response, I want it to calm down. I want to decrease it as much as I can. And then what starts to happen is I start doing behaviors that are probably non-productive to me, and
But
that
we think they're
we think they're
productive.
productive because they do serve a purpose.
Yes.
They have a purpose, which is to regulate us and bring us back down, but they can start to harm us. And so what I think about mind, body, and brain is realizing that a lot of things that happen to us or happens to us can be from a biological standpoint, and it's not just because we're crazy. It's because your
Yes.
brain is trying to help you survive, and then some of the behaviors are trying to help you regulate.
Yes. There is a saying that I have is life is hard and people are doing the best that they can. Another saying I have, because with TikTok and social media, everyone is self-diagnosing. When people come in and they say, "Oh, I think I'm bipolar," I would say life is bipolar.
Yeah.
You're doing the best that you can with what you're given. Let's start there.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to transgenerational trauma, you're saying that people living life receive messages, and those messages are either nourishing them so that they can grow, or they're receiving messages that become challenges that people need to face
Yes.
so that they can overcome and then grow.
Yes.
And so if someone has heard our show today and they have recognized, hey, I'm constantly saying this to myself, I'm weird, or I am not okay unless I am fixing things, or what a common theme is, my worth is tied to what I do for other people. For those who are viewing and listening to our podcast today, what is something someone can do to start their journey to unpacking in healthy ways their own generational trauma?
And I think to start out with, you always have to have a strong support system. That could include family, friends. That can also include you actually seeking out a therapist, because some of this work that you're doing when you try to think about what happened to you can bring up a whole bunch of emotions that maybe you're not ready for. And being able to have that support, again, because we as people are we want connections based. We want to feel like we belong and included. So having a strong support system and maybe going to see a therapist to help you go through this and manage it could be a great place to start. And I always say when working with intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma, it's a quote that I like to think about. And they always say it takes a village to raise a child. But then I add to it, who's raising the village?
Oh, that's a great quote. Yeah. So who's raising the village?
Yes.